following is an account written by Reverend Elias Galloway Hellmantoller of what he witnessed at the hanging of Frank Hyer in 1931. At the request, I went to Moundsville Penitentiary in West Virginia on June 19th to be with Frank Hyer, who was hanged in the penitentiary on that day. I arrived at Moundsville at 5 o'clock that evening, and at 6 o'clock I was ushered into the death cell. There, I met the condemned man, his guard, and one trustee. He was very glad to see me and began at once to tell me of his marvelous Christian experience since I had last seen him about 5 weeks ago. He was the happiest man I had ever seen in my experience as a minister, and he could talk of nothing but the peace and happiness he had in his heart. He requested that I go into the cell with him, which I did. We sat down on his bed, and he gave me a full history of his life up until and including the murder of his wife last December. He told me of all the wicked things he had done, and he said that whiskey had led him to commit the crime for which he was about to pay the penalty of his life for. He also said that while he was in jail in Marlington, before others and myself began to talk to him about the salvation of his soul, he had decided he was just going to unalive himself. And he explained to me how I had saved him from committing this rash act and how thankful he was to me for preserving with him and saving his soul. At the close of our private conversation in the cell, the Protestant chaplain, Reverend W.C. Harold, came in, accompanied by Reverend Don Nichols and another minister from Moundsville. After a short time, we began singing and a prayer service. The singers were prisoners, and this service resulted in the most wonderful blessing to a man that was facing death. At the close of the service, Frank asked me to baptize him, which I did. Of all the prayer meetings I have ever attended, I think this was the greatest, and Frank was the happiest man I ever saw. As his last hour drew near, he dressed for the grim ordeal. He told everyone goodbye, asking us to one day meet him in heaven. Before he began his march towards death, he put his arm around my shoulders and thanked me for leading him to the light of God. At that time I asked him, if he was to receive a pardon today, would he return to his wicked living, or would he go back and spend the rest of his life living for God? He answered by saying if he had his liberty granted him, he would go from home to home and tell of his great salvation and blessings. Many times during the prayer meeting, he would turn to the group and say, when you preach to young men, please tell them to leave whiskey alone, for it has brought me to the scaffold. He did not seem the least bit nervous, and said many times during the 3 hours we were with him that he held nothing against anyone on earth. And he requested that I tell people that he had no malice in his heart. While standing on the scaffold waiting for the trap to be sprung, he listened calmly while Reverend Harold offered a very touching and appropriate prayer. When Frank was asked if he had anything to say, his last statement was this: I am guilty, and whiskey was the cause of it. I am perfectly willing to shed my blood for this crime. Jesus has saved my soul, and I am not afraid to die. The next second, the trap was sprung, and his soul went out to meet with God. He had repented again and again while we conversed with him, and he did not care what the law did with his body, for the Lord would take care of his soul. I have seen over 3,000 persons converted since I entered the ministry, and I can truthfully say that Frank Hyer was the hardest man to convince to be saved. If all the young men of this state could have looked upon the scene that we witnessed in the death chamber and could have known the life of Frank Hyer as I knew it, they would never touch another drop of whiskey as long as they lived. I believe with all my heart that Frank Hyer made his peace with God and that his soul is at rest. That was in the Marlington Journal. Frank abused his wife, witnessed by many. Then, on December 19th, 1930, it got out of hand. The following is an account from Virginia Slavin, born 1891, from Cass, West Virginia. She gave this interview June 12th, 1976, on what she saw the day that Frank murdered his wife. Now, this is a little graphic. I actually took a lot out of it to make it a little bit easier to listen to.
She was a mighty good old lady. She kept all the loggers, the woodsmen came and she took care of them and was good to them. And she set a good table. And then she married this monster. She'd been married to another man. And he was a drunkard. She was married to him and he died. And then she married this old Frank Hyer, and he finally murdered her. Just murdered her brutally. I was working in Elkins when that happened. He just beat her up and stood on her and did everything else. And he dragged her back into the little back room. It's not there now, it's tore down. And he put her in the bathtub. They thought he was trying to revive her. And as he drug her out, she lost her teeth. And they were found after she was buried. Well, at the time this happened, nobody would help. They just wouldn't go in. They heard the ruckus, but they just didn't go in. He didn't shoot her. He drug her around all over the building and through the lobby. And then he drug her out the back through the kitchen. And her mother was sitting there. And he looked at her and said, "I'll get you later." That's what they said. The old grandma was there. And while he had her out and was finishing her up, the grandmother went up the walk and went to a neighbor and hid. And I think she died from grief, thinking about what all happened.
The hanging. The hanging goes wrong. Now let's go back to that evening in 1931. Frank was surrounded by guards and a preacher. Talking up a storm, he turned to the preacher and thanked him for the wonderful Christian experience, confessing to the murder over and over, saying again and again, whiskey caused it. Now it's time. Frank dressed, walked out as he turned to the group of people. "Meet me in heaven, and when you preach, Father, tell young men to leave whiskey alone," he says again. Now he walks to the gallows, stands over the trap door. A noose is placed around his neck as the Reverend begins a prayer, asking for his final words. Frank was never at a loss for words. "I am guilty. I am perfectly willing to shed my blood for this crime. Jesus has saved my soul. I'm not afraid to die." The trap opens and Frank falls, but something wasn't right. The pressure was too much. The rope squeezed Frank's neck with a hard jerk, slicing completely through it, ripping his head from his body. Witnesses were already soured on the idea of public hangings at this time, and this sealed the deal. This was a horrific sight to witness. And that's how Frank Hyer's death started the end of public executions in West Virginia. The executions after that, you had to be invited. And this was also the end to Frank on earth. Fact is, even when you find God, that doesn't mean you don't reap certain things still. Maybe like your head falling plumb off your body. Either way, the world is a little better without the Frank Hyers, is my opinion. So I'm glad that he went on to a better place, even if his earthly head went a different way than his body went. Thanks for watching till the end, and we'll see you next time.